Welcome back everyone, it is Eric from Rare Candy, and today we finally have the full set reveal for Japan's upcoming Pokemon Card 151 set. So still no word just yet at the time of recording on how the set's going to be distributed internationally. I would assume this is going to be like our holiday set later this year, but again, still no exact details on that just yet. But as the name of this set would suggest, this is largely based around the original 151 Pokemon, in addition to some trainer cards, of course. And overall, I would say this set is definitely aimed a little bit more at collectors than players. So I don't know how impactful this thing is going to be, though there are still some interesting cards that we're going to check out today. But with that being said, guys, remember to smack that like button for me, feed that always hungry YouTube algorithm. Let's dive in and check out these new cards coming out. So we're going to kick things off with Venusaur EX here. This is one of the first cards we actually saw from the set. And I don't think this card is that impressive. It does have a ton of HP and actually does have a pretty good tanking ability here, where if it's in the active spot, you can heal 60 from one of your Pokemon, though the active spot requirement is a little bit annoying because if we have Venusaur in the active, this is definitely a card that we're basically attacking with because it has a 4 retreat cost. We're not moving this thing very easily. And if we have to attack with this, I think the card isn't too impressive because it's only doing 150 for 3 energy. Though I guess with the poison and confusion, you're still technically two-shotting things. But being grass Pokemon means it's kind of difficult to get powered up right now. And ultimately, there's just easier ways at two-shotting things instead of setting up a stage 2. So from there, I think to no one's surprise, we do have a new Charizard card. But Charizard EX, I think, actually is kind of cool. Let's take a look. So for fire energy to 60 plus 100 if this Pokemon has any damage counters on it. So that's pretty cool because if we use something like a Magma Basin to get this thing powered up, that means we're hitting 160 for 1 energy, which actually is a pretty good damage to energy ratio. And us being a stage 2 means we might even be able to abuse something like Cheryl to maybe get in some healing action too. But I think the issue there is that after you Cheryl, it's kind of hard to get damage back on your Charizard to reactivate the 100 damage buff, but maybe with things like Damage Pump or something, it's not going to be too hard. We'll have to see. But from there, Charizard does have another attack for a whopping 4 fire, just 330, and we discard 3 energy from this Pokemon. So I think at a glance, while this attack looks pretty impressive in terms of its damage output, it just seems really difficult to actually use. But I do want to push back against that just ever so slightly because we do, of course, have the Pokemon Go Charizard, which, of course, does evolve from the same evolution line. So if you are running Charizard EX, I think you actually could maybe cram maybe 2 of the Pokemon Go one in this theoretical Charizard EX deck. And then from there, Charizard can double your fire energies in place. So at that point, all you need is like a Magma Basin plus a manual attachment, and you can actually use this 330 damage attack for just 2 energy at that point. I don't know how consistent this theoretical Charizard EX deck would be, but you know, I think there's a good bit of support that exists for this card to where I think at the least players probably should at least be testing it when it releases. And so for the final Kanto starter, we do have Blastoise EX. And if I remember right, I think this card actually was pretty decent last time I looked at it. So 330 HP, takes 30 less damage from attacks, so you're effectively like a 360 HP Pokemon at that point. So very few things are probably actually one-shotting you other than lightning Pokemon here. But then for 2 water, you discard up to 2 basic water energy cards from your hand, and does 140 for each card discarded in this way. I really like the fact that you're discarding the energy from hand and not from your Pokemon, because this means you probably don't have to run something like a Baxcalibur as a result. You can probably get away with just running maybe like a thin Palkia line to get powered up. And then from there, it's much easier to chain water energies back to your hand with things like energy retrieval or superior energy retrieval, of course, as opposed to re-accelerating energy to Pokemon. So I really like how they designed this attack, and 280 is a pretty solid number, guys, because that is going to one-shot Pokemon V-Star, and with things like a Choice Belt, you can even one-shot some of the VMAXs, most notably Mew VMAX at that point. But then there are actually some ways to double down on this tanking as well. We have V-Guard energy, of course. We have Radiant Gardevoir. We have Lake Acuity. I don't know if there's something else I'm forgetting, but moral of the story, there are additional ways to make sure your Blastoise doesn't go down. So this card seems pretty good. again, it's a stage 2, guys, but I think this card does have some promise. Okay, we have an interesting Beedrill here, that's for sure. So Beedrill says if you don't have any cards in your hand, this attack does 120 more, and your opponent's active is now poisoned and paralyzed. That's not too bad. You're effectively doing 160 once you factor in the poison damage, which is a 2-shot. And then the paralysis means that if your opponent doesn't have like a switch card, you can get another free hit in on them and just take a knockout at that point. So in a way, if they don't move, this kind of is like a one-hit KO attack. But the issue is you have to have 0 cards in your hand, which I think could be difficult for a deck like this. If this was like an all basic deck, I think it would be a little easier to pull off something like this, but because you're just inherently going to have weird combo pieces like rare candies or Kakunas floating around in your deck, means that you frequently are going to have cards that you can't just play down, which might limit the potential of something like this. Now, that being said, you can play cards like Grant in your deck, or like Squavit, to keep that hand size reduced to a minimum here, but I think this is probably just a little too convoluted to consistently be able to use this, though. We haven't looked through the whole set, guys, so there might be something in here that could help out Beedrill a little bit, but right now it's a cool attack, but it might just require a little too much setup every single turn if we want to use this. So I actually want to highlight Rattata here. I don't think this card is totally awful. We've actually seen some other attacks like this, in recent years too. But this guy does 20 plus 10 more for each damage counter on your opponent's active Pokemon. So if I remember, I think we actually have something like this in format as well. It might be a Farfetch'd or something. It's another, I think, colorless Pokemon, if my memory serves me correctly. But this guy is level ball searchable. You can use a double turbo energy to get it powered up. So I think attacks like this can be decent for like 2-shotting decks out there. Raticate also sort of builds off this attack very similar. It is actually a bit better too, has a much better damage modifier. It's 30 plus 30, which is, definitely a big jump over the Rattata, though this isn't quite as splashable. So even though this attack is substantially better, I think the Rattata is the one that would be more likely to see play out of the two. So we do have a Spearow with the Evolutionary Advantage ability. We've seen this on Pokemon in the past. Definitely a solid ability. If you go second, you can evolve immediately. But that being said, it's on a Spearow. There's not too many great Fearow cards in the format. And this new one, I don't think is any exception either. Beat Catch is okay. You search your deck for 3 cards, put them into your hand. But with us being in a format that is going to be so dominated by cards like Iono, I don't think this is actually going to stick that often. And this card's not really doing a whole lot of damage either. So right now, I don't see a reason to be able to play this Spearow. So next up, we have, if I'm not mistaken, the first ever like ultra rare Arbok card of some sort. So we have Arbok EX, has 2 attacks here. The first one's okay, 70, your opponent can't retreat. But the second one actually is a little bit enticing. So for 3 Dark Energy, does 150, and then your opponent discards 2 cards from their hand here. Admittedly, 3 Dark Energy is actually kind of annoying if we're being honest, but you do have to remember we do have Dark Patch in the format, so it's not totally unrealistic to power this thing up throughout the course of a game with some combination of Dark Patch and or Raihan maybe. So I definitely could imagine a world where, especially in the late game, you put your opponent down to a low hand size with an Iono or a Judge, and then from there you discard 2 cards from their hand and maybe even get down something like a Path to the Peak at that point too. Now, the issue with this attack is that your opponent does choose. If this was you choose at random, that I think alone would be a lot better. But if we do put our opponent down to, let's say, a 4-card hand with something like a Judge, well, your opponent can just choose to keep their supporter that's there. But I'm sure there are going to be times where discarding 2 cards, even if your opponent chooses, is going to be massive. So Arbok EX, I think, does have some degree of potential, but it does have sort of a hefty attack cost, and the damage output, it's kind of okay. You might need some damage modifiers to get this thing up to 2-shot certain things in the format, but it is a card that I think does have some potential. So we do have a new Raichu coming out, and it does have kind of an interesting ability. So whenever your opponent does knock out one of your Pokemon, you can move a Lightning Energy from that Pokemon to this Pokemon. So it's kind of like a built-in EXP share. We saw this on a Lantern back in Celestial Storm, I think it was. That card didn't really see any play. I don't think things are going to be very different for this Raichu either, just because you're devoting essentially 2 slots in your deck for an EXP share. So at that point, I think you're just better off playing EXP share. Okay, so we do have an interesting Sandshrew, I will point out. I don't think Sandslash is particularly good, but Sandshrew here says trainer cards in your opponent's discard pile can't be returned to the deck by the effect of your opponent's item or supporter cards. So this means something like a Pal-Pad actually won't be able to get back supporters, or something like a Schliien won't be able to get back cards. And these are both cards we do CC play. Schliien has sort of fallen off a little bit in Mew decks, though Pal-Pad is still definitely a card we see, much more regular play. So they won't be able to use that, which is cool. That being said, Sandshrew, I don't think its effect is as good, or I don't think its effect is good enough to warrant this taking up a slot in your deck. I think if this ability was like any cards in your opponent's discard pile can't be returned by items or supporters, we'd be in business, because then you could turn off things like Super Odd. It's a neat ability. I like it, but I don't think I'm actually going to be devoting spaces in my deck to this card. Okay, so next up from there, we have a pair of Pokemon we sort of need to talk about together. We have Nidoqueen and Nidoking, since they both have a little bit of synergy with one another. The Nidoqueen here, I think, does have a pretty cool attack. Queen Press does 90 for a Dark and Colorless, and then during your opponent's next turn, you prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from basics. So against decks like Lost Box, Miraidon, Qian Pao, etc., this is actually going to be a pretty good walling attack that we have here. And then I will point out, we technically can use Lunge Out maybe as well with a Reversal Energy for, a more substantive or, heavier hitting attack that we have here. But Nidoking is the other piece to the puzzle. So Nidoking here has this ability. If Nidoqueen is on your bench, this Pokemon's attacks cost no energy. So, which is pretty good, because this attack cost is really annoying otherwise. So for 0 energy, effectively, you're doing 190 and your opponent's active is now poisoned. So effectively 200 for 0. Not too bad, but my issue with this is that unless you're playing like a Radiant Hisuian Sneasler, there's very few Pokemon you're actually ever knocking out with this card. Because 200, it's effectively no different than like 160 most of the time, since you still have to 2-shot V-Stars, you still have to 2-shot V-Maxes, you still have to 2-shot Pokemon EX, and you have to always have 2 Stage 2s in play at a time to be able to pull this off, plus some other damage modifier, again, just to knock out basic Pokemon EX, which is, and of course, basic Pokemon V. So I don't actually think I like this combo of cards that much, if I'm being honest. It just seems like it requires a ton of work for not the biggest payoff in the world. So next up we have Clefable. Has 100 HP, which is kind of annoying. If it was just 10 less, you could actually search out with level all, that would be nice. But for its attacks, Follow Me, switch your opponent, and then Additional Moon. If your opponent's knocked out by damage from this attack, take 1 more prize card. Okay. Actually not a terrible attack. Like 3 Psychic is definitely a lot, but there is a Clefairy that of course accelerates Psychic energy into play. So you can maybe power up Clefairy preemptively with its ability and then evolve into Clefable. But also we could maybe use this with reversal energy. So maybe for some sort of like Zoroark deck, we could transform into this, take an additional prize card. Doesn't seem too bad. But I don't think there's that much we're actually knocking out that has 50 HP or less. So I think we would need something like a Psychic Gloves, or was it Cleansing Gloves? Is that what it is? To knock out things like Ralts, Comfy, etc. There's just not too much in this damage range that we can actually, knock out to exploit this attack. So I actually think this is pretty interesting. I'm just not sure the exact application that is practical for it at the moment. Okay, so we have Ninetales EX. Heat Wave, your opponent's active is burned, so effectively like 60 for 1, not the worst thing in the world. But for Fire Colorist, 80 plus 140 if you have the same number of cards in your hand as your opponent. So the attack cost isn't too bad. With a Magma Basin and an attachment, you can get this guy up and running, be ready to go. and you're hitting for 220, which isn't the worst number in the world. That is going to knock out things like Maridon, like Chien-Pao. And meeting this requirement, it's not too hard. With cards like Iono and Judge, I don't think it's too unrealistic to make this happen. But that being said, if I'm playing a Stage 1 EX or like a V-Star even, since that's kind of something similar, I don't think Ninetales is it. I don't think this is an awful card by any means. I think you could probably build a functioning Ninetales EX deck, but if we're playing this instead of like an Arceus deck, or, you know, insert other decent Stage 1 EX of your choice, I don't see the incentive to play Ninetales. There's not too much that's weak to fire that's like relevant right now either. So for the moment, this card's okay, but it's probably just going to remain in the binder. Okay, so next up we have Wigglytuff EX, which I actually think is a deceptively decent card here. So 250 HP on a Stage 1 EX, but if this Pokemon has any special energy attached, it gets plus 100 HP, which is perfect. It's a colorless Pokemon. You're going to want to use some sort of special energy naturally anyways, but because we have the Wigglytuff from Paldea Evolved that can accelerate the therapeutic energies, that seems like a natural partner for this whole deck. Use the other Wigglytuff to accelerate a therapeutic energy, then slam down more than likely a double turbo for turn as well to power up your Wigglytuff in one go. And now you're a 350 HP Stage 1 EX. That's pretty decent. I know you're not one-shotting anything, especially since we're only hitting for 190 or more than likely 160 with double turbo, but that's okay. The fact that we can just tank hits and just comfortably two-shot everything is not too bad. And now, that being said, we do have to actually play a supporter card from our hand to use this, but we already want to be playing supporters anyways, but that definitely could mean our deck is more susceptible to things like Iono or Roxanne in the late game. So you do probably have to play something like a Burrell in the deck as well to make sure that you don't get disrupted out of the game towards the end. You can even run things like Radiant Gardevoir to make this thing even tankier. Or even, I think there's a new Pokemon tool coming out in this set too, if my memory serves me correct, that makes your Stage 1s more tanky. So there's definitely some support for Wigglytuff, and I think this could be kind of a decent deck. I'm not sure if this is going to be tier 1, but I think there's enough pieces to where this could be at least somewhat viable. Okay, so we do have a new Vileplume evolution line, and don't get scared. This is not an item lock Vileplume. I know a lot of people were thinking that whenever we saw there was going to be a Vileplume with an ability. But this Vileplume, it's a little bit different. Whenever you play this Pokemon from hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you can look at the top 8 cards of your deck and attach a number of basic energy cards you find there to your Pokemon in any way that you like, then shuffle your deck. So we actually have seen this ability before. This was on an Emboar. I forget what set it was from. I think it was from actually the Sword and Shield era, if my memory serves me correctly, or maybe it was the late Sun and Moon era. I forget, but we've seen an Emboar like this. Wasn't very good. Saw like literally zero play. I don't see much incentive to play this Vileplume other than the fact that there is a Gloom that has sort of a similar ability, whereas the Emboar didn't really have any additional support built into its evolution line. So the Gloom does the same thing, but you're only looking at the top 3 cards of deck. I think if you were going to play something like this, there is a Kling Clang that does something a little bit similar, but guarantees the energy. So I think just play that if you are thinking about playing one of these styles of Stage 2 Pokemon. So we do have a Parasect with an interesting attack here. I don't think this is good, but you flip 2 coins for each heads. You search your deck for a grass Pokemon and put it directly onto your bench. So that actually is pretty good. This means we can get Stage 1 Pokemon, V-Stars, Stage 2s, etc. But unfortunately, this is on Stage 1, and it's also on a coin flip attack in a format where we have no ways at, reflipping coins really. So it's a cool attack, but I think if you're going to play something like this, you should probably just play I think it's the Robska that we just got in Paldea Evolved. You're only getting 1 Pokemon, but it's a colorless energy, and there's no coin flips involved. Okay, so next up we have Venomoth here. Venomoth actually is kind of enticing because it has an item lock attack. So it's a level ball searchable Stage 1, so that's definitely a plus right out the gate here. But for a single grass energy just 30, and during your opponent's next turn they can't play any items, and they're also confused which I think is sort of the thing that might tip me over the edge to maybe consider at least trying this out, because 30 in item luck is not very impressive. We have Bennett EX from Scarlet and Violet. Its attack is not hitting enough. That's really what it comes down to at the end of the day. But if we can confuse our opponent and prevent them from playing cards like Switch Card, like Escape Rope, to get out of that confusion, well, now we might be cooking here, because we can even play other cards, maybe like, I don't know, Paldean Clodsire to poison our opponent and hit them with this confusion, and play something like Defiance Band. And once we sort of amass all of these different damage modifiers and ways to disrupt our opponent, it actually could be enough to where this item lock could stick, and we can buy ourselves several turns of being able to abuse this attack. Is there something here? You know, if I'm a betting man, I would probably say no, but the fact that we have all of these sort of, I don't want to say mediocre, but these sort of average pieces that we can combine with Venomoth, it might be like some sort of Voltron Megazord thing where like each of the individual components aren't that great on their own, but once we combine all of these different things, we might have something kind of special here. So we'll have to see, but this is definitely a card I think to at least keep an eye on. Okay, so we have a Persian that searches out Giovanni's Charisma. So if I remember right, it's a supporter card that you return an energy from your opponent to their hand, I think, or maybe it's on top of their deck, I forget. And then you accelerate an energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon, I think. I think most of the time you'd probably just prefer something like a Burrell to be in play. It's a stage 1 as well, and it can find you cards that aren't Giovanni's Charisma as well, in addition to giving you an additional out to that card. So Persian, probably not too great. Alrighty guys, next up we have Alakazam, and as you can see, they finally freed our boy Kadabra after being in TCG jail for the longest time. We finally have another stage 2 proper Alakazam evolution line. So it does have the Mind Jack attack, which we've seen before on different cards, but does 90 plus 30 for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So this gives you kind of a decent, you know, heavier hitting attack that we can maybe make use of. So if our opponent does have a full bench, that's 150, so we're doing 240 with this, if I can successfully do math this morning. So 240 minus 20 for double turbo, so 220 for one attachment, not too bad. So this could be very good against decks like Miraidon or Qianpao that are using these basic attackers with full benches. But definitely I think the most enticing attack this card has is going to be this second one, because for 2 Psychic Energy does 120, and this Pokemon can use this attack even when it's on the bench. And I don't know if we've seen an attack like this before. We've seen plenty of Pokemon that do like hit and run style effects where they attack then go to the bench, but rarely, if ever, have we seen something like this. And this, I think, does open this deck up to some really interesting partners, because now we can attack with Alakazam on the bench, while we have cards like Klefki or Mimikyu, Miltank, or Diancie in the active spot, walling against our opponent or maybe disrupting them in some sort of way. But this Pokemon doesn't hit for a lot, and it does require 2 Psychic Energy. So we are going to need a way at cheating the second Psychic Energy. I don't think we want to play Gardevoir, just because I don't think Alakazam's a great partner for Gardevoir. I mean, Gardevoir is a decent partner for Alakazam, but it's not really a great partner for Gardevoir, if that makes any sense at all. Like, a Gardevoir deck that's playing Alakazam is just worse than other Gardevoir decks. So I think we would need to play something like Raihan or EXP Share, some way at chaining these Alakazams throughout the course of a game. So next up we have Machamp, and this is definitely not my favorite Machamp card that we've had. Definitely has a great ability though. If this Pokemon would be knocked out by damage of an attack, flip a coin of heads, it's not knocked out, and its HP becomes 10. So that's pretty good. What is not good is this attack. So for 2 fighting, it does 100, but we do mill the top 2 cards of our opponent's deck, so that does help a little bit, but 100 on a stage 2 is not cutting it. Like, even with a Defiance Band, we still are going to have to like 3-shot Pokemon V-Star or VMAX or even stage 1 EXs a lot of the time. So if this attack was like 130, maybe I could make an exception because then we would be two-shotting some of these Pokemon. But yeah, this attack is just nowhere near as good as I think it actually needs to be. So we do have a Golem EX, and I actually don't remember seeing this card get revealed. So this actually might be a brand new reveal. But 330 HP makes sense. Golem's always been a very tanky boy. But for a fighting energy, does 50 during your opponent's next turn. This Pokemon's attacks do 120 more to your opponent's active Pokemon. And then Rock Bomber, 180 for 3. I don't really like this attack at all, if I'm being honest, but I actually think I like this attack because what this means is after we do this initial 50 damage, we're hitting for 170 over and over. And that's a good number, guys. That is a nice two-shotting amount to hit for. And because this only attacks for a single fighting energy and it has 330 HP, means that I think this is a pretty good candidate for Cheryl. I think we just need some sort of engine to keep finding Cheryls every turn. So maybe something like a heavy barrel line for a deck like this, or maybe even like a Gallade line. So we could use things like Curlia and then evolve into Gallade eventually to search out our Cheryls. It does sort of have the same issue that Metagross VMAX I think has, where yes, this damage increase is nice, but as soon as this thing hits the bench, this effect is reset and then you're doing 50 again on the next turn. So, okay, so I'm actually growing to like this less and less because now that I'm thinking about it, if your opponent's able to just keep bossing around this thing and just resetting you to 50 every turn, I mean, at that point, you're like, how much of a threat really are you? So maybe you have to play some copies of Double Turbo Energy just to threaten the Rock Bomber attack from time to time. But that being said, I think this card is still okay, and I'll probably still mess around with it when it comes out. Okay, so we do have a new Magneton, guys, and even though this card I don't think is going to be like a Junk Hunt style archetype or anything, just because it is a stage 1, I actually do still kind of like this attack. Again, it's the same as the old Junk Hunt attack on Sableye. If you are playing Magnezone EX in your deck, this is probably your ideal Magneton of choice. So on a turn, if you do whiff what you need for your Magnezone EX, you can still attack with this, get back maybe like a rare candy and a level ball or something like that for the next turn, just to keep your deck rolling. So it's probably nothing too insane, but you know, this might just be our best Magneton to go with for Magnezone EX decks, if those are even a thing in the future. Okay, next up we have Dodrio, and this card I think is kind of interesting. Its ability says you must put a damage counter on this Pokemon in order to use its ability, but then once during your turn, you may draw a card. And this does stack, guys, so if you do have 4 Dodrios in play, you can draw 4 every turn while stacking up damage counters on these things. And this attack luckily does have some synergy here. It is 10 plus 30 for each damage counter on this Pokemon. So if we do get Dodrio down to just 10 HP remaining, let's do the math on that. That'd be 270, so 280 damage for 1 energy. Not the worst thing in the world. I do want to point out, though, I will say I think it is going to be difficult to accumulate these damage counters like for that many turns in a row without these things just getting bossed up on the bench. So if you do want to attack with this thing, you might have to play things like Damage Pump in order to sort of expedite the process of, you know, getting this guy up and running. So you might have to play things like Gengar, but this also maybe could be a consideration for Hisuian Zoroark V-Star. Definitely has a lot of natural synergy there. We've seen those decks play Barrel in the past, which is another stage 1 sort of consistency boosting Pokemon. You know, I think Barrel definitely has a better ability, but this one, you're sort of trading off your reduced draw power, at least for an ability that has synergy with Zoroark's attack, and also does give you a backup attacker, maybe in the late game too. So I think this Dodrio is actually a pretty cool card. I really do like this card's design, but Hisuian Zoroark hasn't been that great lately, and I'm not sure if you can successfully build around this card on its own, especially since Lost Zone decks exist and Sableye is just going to ruin your whole day. Okay, so next up we have Gengar, as well as a Haunter. So let's check out Haunter. Has an ability, once during your turn, when you play this card from your hand to evolve a Pokemon, you may choose a supporter card from your opponent's discard pile and put it into their hand. So when would we want to use this? So I know we've had Pokemon in the past where it's like, look at your opponent's hand, use a supporter card that's there as the effect of the attack. So maybe something like that. Let's check out Gengar before we get too carried away thinking about this, though, because I'm sure there's going to be some synergy here, or I would imagine at least. So Gengar, though, 130 HP, so a little bit on the low side for a stage 2, but does have free retreat, so that's definitely pretty cool. So this makes sense now. We have the Poltergeist attack on Gengar. Does 50 for every trainer card in your opponent's hand. Now, it's definitely a bit of a bummer giving your opponent a supporter card back, since they can just reuse that Iono or that boss, whatever it is you're putting back into their hand. But if it means you're getting a one-shot on them, it might be a trade-off that that you're okay with, especially if they are playing around this Poltergeist attack. Then Gengar's other attack, 110, put 3 damage counters. I don't think this is that great, but Poltergeist, I do think, is a little bit more enticing. We've seen several of these attacks be good over the years. So is there a chance this Gengar could see play? You know what? I think there is. We do have cards like Iono to refresh our opponent's hand. We do have this Gengar as well, so maybe we do choose to play like kind of a thicker line of Haunter to give us more outs to this. And the fact that this is only a single Psychic Energy also comes with its own benefits, because obviously we gain the benefits of using things like Fog Crystal, but also we can maybe even play Luminous Energy to give us access to like Radiant Charizard or other single energy attachment attackers if our opponent is playing around this style of attack. So I kind of like what we got going on here with Gengar. This could be a sort of sleeper card in the set, though. Again, guys, it is a stage 2. It is an attack that is reliant on what your opponent's doing. So there are definitely some issues this card might have to overcome. Okay, this Onix card is kind of cute. It's probably not very good, but this could easily be like a PTCG Live deck. But for 2 colorless energy, you discard the top 5 cards of your deck and does 80 for each Pokemon with a 4 retreat that you discard in this way. So if you discard all 5 being Pokemon with 4 retreat, you're doing 400 damage, which is absolutely insane. But I think more than likely, if you're just hitting even 4, that's sort of like the magic number, because then you can one-shot pretty much anything you go up against. But of course, the issue with this is that your deck has to be absolutely stacked with 4 retreat Pokemon, and I don't think there's that many great 4 retreat Pokemon that really help out your deck, at least not that I can think of. I'll have to comb through the card pool and see if there's any I'm forgetting, but I'm trying to think of like consistency boosting Pokemon and like Pokemon you would want to play regardless of this attack. I don't know how many there actually are. So we do have a Drowsy with a cool ability. Whenever you play it from hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, you leave your opponent's active sleep. So that's nice, but your opponent can just flip out of sleep. They can play Switch. And if we don't even have Scoop Up Net anymore, so it's not really even that easy to reuse this effect. I think if we ever play this, we would basically want this if we are trying to activate some sort of like damage modifier from our opponent being asleep or something kind of like that. Okay, so next up we have Electrode, and let me tell you, this is my type of card right here. So stage 1 Pokemon, level ball searchable, which is definitely important, but the attack here, so before doing any damage, you can discard any number of tools from your Pokemon, but that is 40 more for each card you discarded in this way. So this is like the Whimsicott back from Vivid Voltage. That was a pet deck of mine at the time. Very similar attack here, almost the same in fact. But what this means is if we discard a Pokemon tool from all of our Pokemon in play, that's going to be, what, 260 damage? So 6 times 4 plus the 20 base damage. But we do have to remember we have Haunch Crovi in the format, so we can actually jam 4 tools on each of those to increase our damage cap even more. And then we also have a new Snorlax and Leftovers coming out in this same set, which pair perfectly with this Electrode, because Snorlax has an ability where you can use its ability to get 2 leftovers from your discard back into your hand. So if you have 2 Snorlax in play, every turn you can guarantee 4 leftovers back into your hand every turn to make sure that you don't run out of tools to actually use this attack. Now, that being said, was Whimsicott like ever a great deck? I mean, I'd be lying if I said yes. It was like, actually probably legitimately, it was probably like a tier 2, tier 2.5 deck. Literally the same format it released into, but after that it saw 0 play. So is Electro Dynasty play? I don't know. We'll have to see about that. I want it to. It'd be nice to, that's for sure. But definitely a card I'm absolutely going to be taking for a spin when it comes out. Okay, so we do have a new Executor. I don't think this card is particularly great, but this could maybe be a Zoroark toolbox target in the future for its attack here. 30 plus 30 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active. So if you're going against something like Tyranitar V, you can transform into this thing with a reversal energy. I'm pretty sure that's a KO, or you would need double turbo plus a choice belt, I believe. So there's some application for this thing, but definitely never going to be a card that is going to be like a deck of its own or anything like that. Okay, next up we have actually a surprisingly good Cubone. Its ability says the attacks of your Marowak do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. Bad news is there's not many great Marowak cards in the format, and I don't think this one changes anything, though this might actually be our best one we have to work with. But the good news is what we can actually do with this, if we use Zoroark to transform into Marowak, we can actually keep our Cubones unevolved on the bench to get these damage buffing abilities. So let's say we have 3 Cubone on the bench, just as an example. We can actually hit for what, 120 plus a 30 snipe? Seems like a lot of work to do a 120 and 30 snipe, but you can do it. So I guess with cards like Choice Belt, Defiance Badge, you can buff this even more, but I'm not convinced that this Marowak is good enough for this Cubone to be able to see play. But definitely a Cubone to keep in your binder for sure. Might be good someday if we ever get any better Marowak cards. All right, so next up we have Weezing here. So Weezing says, if this Pokemon is any active and is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, flip a coin of heads. The attacking Pokemon is KO'd. Okay, we cooking over here. We cooking. Let's see its attack. 50, just 10 to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. Ugh. Yeah, okay, so the attack is not great. Let's be honest, guys. This is not a particularly good attack. With a double turbo energy, you're actually hitting for 30. Ugh, feels bad. So if we were ever going to play Weezing, I actually don't even think we're attacking with this card, if I'm being honest. If we're doing 50 over and over, and our opponent just gets knocked out by the ability, the damage we're doing is literally just irrelevant at that point. So if this card ever does see play, I feel like it's more as like a hit and run style deck, or maybe with like the Alakazam EX we looked at, where we just leave this in the active spot and force our opponent to attack into that while we keep our attackers safe on the bench. Is that going to be good enough? I'm not convinced, but it is definitely a pretty solid ability. Okay, so we have potentially a very gimmicky Chansey here. Chansey has this ability, if you took it as a face down prize card and your bench isn't full, you can put it on your bench, then flip a coin of heads, take 1 more prize card. So this definitely gives me big vibes of the old greedy dice cards that were pretty terrible. If we're just being honest, they're definitely fun for some memes online, but didn't really see competitive play. I'm not sure if Chansey is going to fare any better, even though we do have cards like Peonia or what Arc Phone, I think, can do something like this to put Chansey into the prizes. You're going to need a deck that's like very low maintenance, that has the extra bench space to accommodate these Chanseys. But I think the idea here is you eventually take a prize, maybe you knock out even with like Stoutland V, that would actually be hilarious. You knock out something like Stoutland or the Clefable we looked at here today, where you're already taking additional prizes. You rip Chansey off the prizes, you flip heads, you rip another Chansey off the prizes, you flip heads, and you just keep that going to like take all of your prizes in one go. I'm sure someone's going to pull this off online and there's going to be like a clip of it circulating Twitter or something, but I don't think this is probably competitive, especially without a reliable way to guarantee Chansey in the prizes. Again, we do have Peonia, but that is going to be a supporter card. Not really what you want to see, but it's definitely cool. And if we ever do have a good Blissey, I feel like it's probably worth playing Chansey just for like the off chance that, no pun intended, that you can rip this off the prizes on the turns where you are taking KOs. Alrighty, so we have Kangaskhan EX here. Triple draw just gets you 3, and then Machine Gun Punch. Flip 4 coins is 100 for each heads. Okay. So on average, you're hitting 200 with this thing, which definitely is respectable. And I guess with with a choice belt or a defiance band, you can knock out like basic attackers. I think you're really shooting for 3 heads here, if at all possible. That's sort of the magic number, because then you can one-shot stage 1 EXs, V-stars, and then with a belt or a band, you can knock out Pokemon V-Max. What are we playing Kangaskhan in? I don't really know. I guess maybe Lugia, since you're a colorless-based attacker. If you just need like a big like high roll attack to close out the game, I mean, you have this. I think Weird Ear V might be a little bit better, but it is an option, guys. And if we ever get a way to reflip our coin flips, maybe this could be a card to revisit, but right now it doesn't seem that great. So we actually have another Swim Freely Pokemon. I don't know if you guys remember, but back in, I believe it was Lost Origin, or maybe it was Astral Radiance, one of those sets, we got a Finneon that accelerated energy to Pokemon with the Swim Freely attack. So we have another one in the mix here. We have Seaking, and it does 60 plus 30 more for each water attached to this Pokemon. So the idea here, of course, is we just dump a ton of energy on a Seaking, take big one-hit KOs. But my issue with this is that the Dugong that already exists, I think, is probably just better, because in the case of Dugong, you put the energies back into your deck. So when Dugong gets knocked out, you don't lose all of your energy too. It's safely nestled in your deck for the next turn. And as a result, I don't think Seaking is that great. It really does much to move the needle for that archetype. But that being said, it's still nice to see some of these archetypes like this get additional support in future sets. So I'm kind of hoping we see similar updates for things like the United Wings deck to be able to maybe help that out a little bit more. But Seaking, unfortunately, doesn't do too much for this particular archetype. Okay, so we have a neat Starmie here. Starmie has this ability. You can put 2 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon, and if you did, you discard this Pokemon and all attached cards. So I think this ability seems good at a glance, but you do have to remember this is almost the same as the ability we had on Flapple from the Sword and Shield era, and that Flapple unfortunately never really caught on, which bummed me out because I loved that Flapple card. It was always one of my pet cards I really wanted to make work. But Starmie is a little bit worse because this doesn't go back into your deck. This just gets discarded. Now, that being said, it is a 90 HP stage 1, which means you can get it back with a Rescue Carrier, which is great. Don't get misconstrued, but it naturally requires you to devote more cards to your deck, whereas Flapple never really did. What deck is this going in? I don't really have a great answer for that, guys. The ability is cool, so maybe Starmie will do what Flapple never managed to do, but right now I don't have a ton of hope for it. But cool ability though. So next up we have Mr. Mime here. Mr. Mime says, if this Pokemon and your opponent's active have the same number of energy attached, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's active Pokemon. That's actually pretty cool. But unfortunately its attack, not that great. You just spread 3 damage counters any way that you like. But guys, it seems like there's a lot of decks that can play around this. You know, if it's a Lost Box deck, they can gust around this thing. They have attackers that require varying degrees of energy. If they're a Gardevoir deck, they can accelerate past the number of energy needed to wall against them. If they're a Chien-Pao deck, Baxcalibur can give them additional energies to bypass this. So this ability is cool, but it just seems a little bit easy for your opponent to play around most of the time. So next up we have Jinx EX, and I think this is another Pokemon that this is the first ultra rare card we've ever seen for it. So kind of cool for Jinx to finally get the multi-prize treatment, or I think this is it. Maybe there was one in the like original EX era, but I don't think there was. Pretty sure. Anyways, this first attack on Jinx actually is pretty cool. If your opponent's active is asleep, it is now knocked out. So if you think back to the Hypno that we just looked at earlier, we can maybe use that to force your opponent asleep, instantly KO them. And I definitely think this attack could be especially good against like multi-prize decks, just because you actually don't need to put them asleep that many times to close out a game. But I could certainly see this card struggling a fair bit against single prize decks, because our methods of putting our Pokemon or our opponent's active Pokemon asleep are actually kind of limited. Like Hypno is a coming into play ability. There's the Parasect that has, again, I think it's a coming into play ability. The only one I can think of that puts your opponent to sleep just kind of perpetually is I think it's the Venusaur from Pokemon Go. It's on a coin flip, but that can be a way you can inflict sleep. Overall, I think this attack, even though it seems really strong at a glance, I don't think it's actually that great because a lot of decks are still just going to out-trade you. Being a 200 HP basic means that a lot of stuff can just knock you out anyways. You can play, Bravery Charm to increase your HP a little bit since you don't need to increase your damage since you're not actually doing damage. But again, I'm not sold on this. I think this attack is pretty good in certain situations, in certain matchups, but I think a lot of decks are going to have outs to this. And if you ever play against something that can prevent effects of attacks, or even like Lugia is going to be playing Therapeutic Energy with Snorlax, you really have no answers to a deck like that. So yeah, I think Jinx seems just a little bit gimmicky. So next up we have Ditto. This was a card we did see get revealed already, and I do think this ability is actually pretty good here. So this ability only can be used if this Pokemon is in the active spot and only on your first turn. So then you search your deck for a basic Pokemon except any Ditto. If you do, discard this Pokemon and all attached cards and put that Pokemon in its place, then shuffle your deck. So this card I definitely think serves a couple of different roles. It acts as just like up to 4 additional outs to one of your core Pokemon. But I think where this card gets a little bit more interesting is allowing you to start the game with very specific Pokemon. So let's say you open with Ditto, or you have an out to Ditto in your opening hand, and your hand's dead. Well, you can transform into something like a Squawkabill EX, then bail yourself out of that dead hand. Or if you are playing Klefki and you're going up against a Lost Box deck, well, you can switch into Klefki, start walling them, stuff like that. So I definitely think this ability is cool for these sort of situations. What deck is actually going to play Ditto? I'm still not sure, to be honest. This strikes me as the type of card that could see play. And, think of something like the Wormadoms that exist, where you want additional Pokemon in the discard and you want to play, just more physical Pokemon in your deck for those sorts of situations. But, those styles of attackers aren't the greatest right now. So again, I don't have a great answer for you guys, again, right off the bat here of what Pokemon or what deck I think it really needs to play this, but it's definitely a good ability. So we have all of the evolutions here, and they're all largely similar Pokemon. They all have kind of a average, mediocre first attack for 30 damage, but they all have this second attack that does 180 if your opponent's active is an EX or a V. So I think in theory, you're playing your EVs or maybe even like a Zoroark toolbox deck, and then you transform or evolve into the evolution that you need to hit certain decks for weakness. So once your opponent knocks out something, you evolve, slap down reversal energy, and just blow away one of their Pokemon V. So if they're playing a Lugia deck, you get out your Jolteon. If they're playing, I don't know, Meowscarada EX or Caparajah EX, you transform into Flareon, etc. I don't know if there's going to be like an actual evolution deck. I think more than likely we would maybe see one of these in like a Zoroark style deck. But if I'm not mistaken, I think the Ceruledge that came out in Paldea Evolved actually does the same thing, but hits for 220, I think. So that might just be a little bit better than going this route, but definitely cool cards. Because reversal energy exists, I think we at least have to sort of keep these cards in the back of our mind though. We have a new Amistar, and this is a new stage 2, and important to keep in mind, this is also a fossil Pokemon, so that definitely does impact, how challenging it's going to be to get this thing into play. But has a pretty good ability. If it's in the active spot, your opponent can't retreat. So this is the same ability on Snorlax, but on a stage 2 fossil. So this is already kind of a red flag that we have here. And then 90, 30 to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. So yeah, this is actually a surprisingly bad fossil card. Usually these fossil Pokemon, even though they're notoriously difficult to get in play, they're usually still like kind of decent cards ignoring their fossil mechanic. But this is just pretty bad overall, I'd say. Now, Kabutops is a little bit more interesting in terms of a fossil Pokemon. Definitely has a solid ability here. Apply weakness for your opponent's active as 4 times instead. So that's definitely pretty cool. We did see, what was it? When the super effective glasses came out, I remember we saw a deck that was popping up in Japan where they played all of these puny little like basic Pokemon that hit for like 10, 20, 30 damage. and they were taking big one-hit KOs thanks to the super effective glasses. I could maybe see a similar world existing for Kabutops here. I think I really have to just look through the card pool and see how many sort of Pokemon like that exist for Kabutops to be able to exploit, but if nothing else, this is better than the Amistar for whatever that counts for. Okay, and as you would expect, we also do have an Aerodactyl to go with our other fossils. Aerodactyl is actually pretty cool. It's a stage 1, so already that's an improvement over the other ones. But its second attack in particular is pretty cool. For 2 colorless energy, does 100, and then you de-evolve your opponent's active back into their hand. So very similar to the Golurk V that still exists in the format, but this of course is going to be just for 2 colorless energy instead of the whopping, Psychic 3 colorless I think Golurk has. So that's cool, but my issue with this is that a good portion of the evolutions that we have in the format are going to be Pokemon V. So what that means is a lot of the time when we're using this attack to de-evolve our opponent's active, let's say they're a Mew VMAX or an Arceus V-Star, we're not taking a knockout with this attack. But I could see a world as we get deeper into the Scarlet and Violet era where the majority of our evolution attackers are EXs. Well, whenever we de-evolve them, if they rare candied into a stage 2 and we had de-evolved them back to maybe their Ralt as an example, or insert low HP basic of choice, then we're actually effectively just taking one-shots on these big evolution Pokemon. We're only getting 1 prize card more than likely, but sometimes that is enough if it really does disrupt your opponent's board. So Aerodactyl is a card that I think could maybe even have some long-term potential. We'll have to see. Up next, we do have the Snorlax I mentioned earlier when talking about Electrode. Does have the Gluttony ability where you get 2 leftovers from your discard pile, put them back into your hand. Its application might be a little bit limited for the moment, but that's okay if the Electrode deck does wind up being decent. Okay, so next up we have all of the legendary birds, and kind of like with the evolutions, they do have sort of a similar theme throughout all of them. They all have an ability that gives them free retreat if they have their respective energy attached to them. But honestly, I don't really care for the attacks on any of these Pokemon, if we're just being honest. Like the Articuno does 110, spreads 10 to all of your opponent's Pokemon. Like, yeah, you can knock out Cramorant with this, but I don't know how often this 10 damage is going to be relevant. Zapdos EX does 120, then does 90 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon, but they do have to have damage counters already on it, which is definitely a bit of a bummer. If this was just 120, 90, we would definitely be in business. That's actually, I think, a much more fair attack too, since this would just be 30 damage better than Radiant Greninja and you're a multi-prize Pokemon. Now, I will say, I think there's a Pincurchin that spreads 10 to everything for a single lightning energy, so you could do that, I suppose. This just does not seem like a strong enough attack to build your lightning deck around. Like, I feel like if we're playing a lightning basic, we would rather just play Miraidon. We'd rather just play Raikou V. We'd rather even just maybe set up a Magnezone V-Star instead. Like, it's nice that you have a pivot Pokemon, especially since you can promote this thing. And, well, there is still a world where maybe this could be like a one of in Miraidon decks. So for like V-Stars, if you're not one-shotting them, like if you just do 220, yeah, we can pick them off with this 90 damage sniping attack. So maybe there is merit to this as a one of. Yeah, the more I'm talking about it, maybe this could be a one of in Miraidon decks, but still not super sold on this card. Kind of the same thing for this Moltres, another sniping attack. This does 120 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. That's just not that great for 3 energy, even with something like the Pokemon Go Charizard, or even just like Raihan, Magma Basin Attachment. This is just not strong enough, I think. So I'd say Moltres is probably the worst out of all of these, then Articuno, then Zapdos probably leading the pack. So we have our only Dragon Pokemon of the set that's going to be Dragonite, but unfortunately, I don't think this card is that great. So your Pokemon play have no retreat cost. Definitely cool, won't turn that down, but its attack just unfortunately is not very good. We can probably build a functioning Dragonite deck. I can actually definitely see synergy with the Celebrations Mew as well, because if we're playing the Dragonite, that gives Mew free retreat, and we can use Mew to, find our rare candies, find our Dragonites, and all that stuff. But we just aren't doing enough damage to build around this thing. And I don't think we're playing this just for this ability. There's already a Hisuian Sneasler that reduces your retreat by 2. That's a stage 1. And I think most of the time that's effectively going to be the same as having no retreat cost. So right now, I don't see the incentive to play this, but if we do get a Dragonite EX that's worth playing, maybe this could slot in as like a 1 to 2 of. Okay, we're getting down to the wire when it comes to our Pokemon. We have a Mewtwo with some seriously awesome art. This looks absolutely amazing. And Mewtwo, I think it's an okay card. Psy Strike does 130, discard 2 energy. Don't think that's particularly great. But Reflector Barrier is a little bit more interesting. Does 20, and during your post-next turn, if this Pokemon takes any damage from attacks, put the same number of damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. So while I think a lot of the time just doing 20 and baiting your opponent and attacking you isn't that great, where this could be good is if you are going against something like a Gardevoir deck where you bait them into just charging up a big Zacian or a big Gardevoir to knock out your V-Star or your, whatever Pokemon you're attacking with. Usually they're going to leave themselves with only a couple of HP remaining. You can come in with Mewtwo, take the knockout, get a prize, and then if they attack back into your Mewtwo, you're going to get another 1 to 2 prizes as a result. So there's definitely some plays where this could be good, but it's still not insane by any means though. And for our last Pokemon, we have Mew EX, which is a card we already sort of knew about, but I think this card is pretty good. Its ability says we can draw until we have 3 cards in our hand. So this is pretty similar to the Kricketune V that we have in format, though Kricketune does give you the option to draw up to 4 if it's in your active instead. But Mew, it can't be targeted with Serena, so that's good. Also, it does have free retreat, which is something that Kricketune doesn't have. And this actually does stack. If we have 2, 3, or 4 Mew EX, for some reason, we can keep using these over and over. And if you are a deck that does get crippled by those late game Roxans, those late game Ionos, Mew definitely could be a good option for your deck to be able to give yourself a little bit of help in those situations. Though you still are kind of in a bad spot if you're going against a deck that has access to Path in addition, but it's still a good ability. Don't get that misconstrued. But the attack, also not that bad either for 3 colors synergy. Choose one of your opponent's active Pokemon's attacks and use it as this attack. So I think overall, I just like how splashable this Mew is as a card because any deck can use it for its ability, and any deck that has any degree of energy acceleration can also use this attack. It is a low HP, multi-prize Pokemon that can be disrupted by Path to the Peak, so we'll have to see what comes of it. Okay, but getting into our trainer cards, the first one is Energy Sticker. So this is a card that we did not see previously. Flip a coin of heads, attach a basic energy from discard to one of your benched Pokemon. Okay, so this is actually very, very close to the Turbo Patch card that we lost in the last rotation. But it's a little bit different. Turbo Patch allows you to attach to any Pokemon not just benched. So that was definitely an upside to that. And you couldn't attach to Pokemon GX. So this is actually probably a little bit worse than Turbo Patch. But even despite that, Turbo Patch did see some play towards the beginning of its lifespan and different Eternatus decks. So there is still precedent for this card to be decent, especially for types that don't have the greatest energy acceleration. Think of like fighting as an example for your Ting Lu decks. This might be a consideration to keep cheating energies throughout the course of a game. So even though it is pretty versatile, it's still not the strongest card in the world. So next up we have Snatch Arm. This was another, I think, early reveal from the set. You look at your opponent's hand, choose a Pokemon you find there, put it at the bottom of your opponent's deck. So this could be a little bit of a control card that we have here. Could even pair with like the Arbok EX that we looked at. So you can maybe put a Pokemon at the bottom of your opponent's deck, eliminating one of the cards you can discard, and then use Arbok's attack to maybe guarantee discarding something a little bit more impactful. Overall, I think this card is very niche though. But next up we have the new fossil cards, and I actually really like that they've sort of overhauled the fossil mechanic. Largely, it's very similar to what we've seen in the past, but now each of these fossils have their own unique abilities, which I think is really cool. So the old Helix fossil in particular here says, as long as this Pokemon is in the active, your opponent can't play any stadium cards from their hand. So that's pretty cool. And even outside of a deck that would play Amistar, there is consideration for playing this just for this effect, which is something that I think is really cool for these cards. Just, I think makes deck building all that more interesting going forward, having these things. And for the final fossil, of course, we have the Old Amber. And I just want to point out too, the artwork on all of these fossils looks absolutely A+ here. But this one says, prevent all effects of your opponent's abilities. done to this Pokemon. So for Pokemon like Meowscarada EX or like Inteleon VMAX, they're not going to be able to target this thing down, which is pretty cool as well. So next up from there, we have Safety Goggles. So Safety Goggles is kind of a reprint. It's sort of a pseudo reprint, if you will, of the old weakness policy, but a little bit more limited. It says this basic Pokemon has no weakness, and weakness policy did the same thing, but you could use it on any Pokemon, not just basics. So this definitely is a lot more limiting, but I think this is actually pretty balanced because, you know, stage 2 Pokemon V-Star, etc., they have a lot more HP. You don't necessarily need to eliminate their weakness sometimes because they are just inherently tankier. And even though I'm usually against basic support like this because basics usually overwhelmingly see the most support in the game, unfortunately, this one's actually not that bad just because they aren't very tanky already. And I don't think this really throws off the balance of the format, or I don't think its effect is good enough to actually make a huge dent in the game outside of maybe some weirdly specific instances. So on the flip side, we have a card that helps out stage 2 Pokemon. That's going to be Big Balloon. It's going to reduce their retreat cost to 0. So this definitely could be good, though it is, again, just limited towards a certain type of Pokemon. There definitely could be situations where this is good. Think of something like the Alakazam EX that we looked at. We can slap that down on Alakazam, retreat and do some other Pokemon as an example. But, you know, a lot of the time we would prefer probably just to play Switch or Escape Rope, just because those cards are good in the early game and not just in the mid and late game on our stage 2s. I don't mind it existing in the format, especially since we don't really have any other of these sort of like tool cards that reduce retreat costs. It does fill sort of a unique role in the format right now. So from there we have Rigid Band. This is going to be our stage 1 supporting tool card. And this one I think actually might even be the best of the bunch here. It's going to reduce damage to the stage 1 it's attached to by 30. So we did just look at the Wigglytuff EX earlier in the set. This card definitely pairs perfectly with that because between its ability and this, it's a plus 130 maximum HP essentially. Or we also just got the Copperajah EX back in Paldea Evolved. So if we have this on Copperajah, that's taking 60 less damage from attacks every turn. And that's excluding if we have something like a Crystal Cave in play as well. So that seems like a natural partner there. As we get more and more stage 1 EXs, if we don't need any damage modifiers like Choice Belt or Defiance Band, this could even be like the go-to Pokemon tool card for these styles of attackers. So I think this one actually is kind of solid. And I'm pretty sure this is our last Pokemon tool card of the set. That's going to be Leftovers. We already kind of mentioned this card earlier when talking about the Electrode and the Snorlax. But for the actual effect on Leftovers, it is going to heal 20 from your active that's attached to at the end of your turn. I think the most promising use I see currently is going to be with the Electrode and the Snorlax. But there still are some weird situations, like if you're a Gardevoir deck, you could use this kind of like in the way that we've seen people use the Emergency Jelly to heal their Pokemon going back into their opponent's turn to make their Pokemon tank a little bit more. So that's a possibility. Really just like any decks that I think damage themselves, whether it's the Gardevoir deck or decks that play Magma Basin, this could be used in those sort of situations to make your Pokemon a little bit tankier to survive a hit going into the next turn. Overall, I think this effect is pretty weak. It's just kind of nice that the Snorlax is able to get it back out of the discard pile. Okay, getting into our supporters, we have Erica's Invitation. This is a card I do remember seeing before, but your opponent reveals their hand. You choose a basic you find there, put it on their bench, but you then switch that Pokemon to the active spot. So it's kind of like the opposite of the, I don't even know how you pronounce it, the Furisode or whatever girl that came out back in Silver Tempest, I think it was. And this is kind of like even the old Captivating Pokepuff that we saw back in the day during the XY era. But this is a supporter card, so its uses definitely are going to be a little bit more niche. It's really a clunky card to use because you normally do want to use an Iono, you do want to use Bossasaurus, you do want to use Professor's Research. If you're taking a turn off to use this, it's just kind of hard to make that happen sometimes. But again, for those control decks out there, this definitely could be a card they could look to. So if you are playing like the Snorlax lock deck or a deck that's using Mawile, well, you can bring a Pokemon into the active your opponent doesn't want and trap them there, I think. So this definitely could be a card for control decks, but other than that, I don't think this is going to be a card that sees a lot of play. So we have Giovanni's Charisma, a card we already did briefly mention earlier, but you put an energy from your opponent's active into their hand. If you do, attach an energy from your hand to your active Pokemon. So I think this card's actually kind of cool. It fills a role for both control decks and honestly non-control decks too. Like even if your deck's not built around disrupting your opponent's energy, if you just need extra ways at attaching energy, again with like, let's say a Ting Lu EX deck or some fighting deck that doesn't have a lot of acceleration, this can just be a bonus effect of disrupting your opponent a little bit in the process. So that's kind of cool. I think it's pretty flexible. The control decks that are built around denying energy are going to like this. The decks that just want a little bit of extra energy acceleration can like this. And it also doesn't specify basic energy, which means we can accelerate things like double turbo energy, reversal energy, etc. So I think Giovanni really does help us in a number of different circumstances. Maybe the Wigglytuff EX that we looked at could like something like this. Hard to say just yet, but I do think this is a better supporter than I think I've seen some people seem to indicate. So cool card. So for our last supporter card, we have Bill's Teleport. And I do love the art on this thing. Great art style on this card. But we look at the top 8 cards for a deck. We reveal any number of Pokemon we find there, put them into our hand, then shuffle the other cards back into our deck. So it's kind of like Great Ball, but you dig one card deeper and you get any Pokemon you find there, not just a single one. But that being said, I think this card is pretty weak overall. Like if you're a deck that's playing near 30 Pokemon, maybe you could play this just because you're going to get maybe 3 to 4 Pokemon on average. And decks that specifically don't want to dump their hand and just want to expand their hand size. Otherwise, I don't think you would ever play this. So this would require a very, very specific type of deck to ever see play. So definitely not one of my favorite supporters that we have. And for our final card of the set, we have Cycling Road, new stadium card. So once during each player's turn, that player may discard a basic energy from their hand. If they do, they draw a card. So it's kind of like a nerfed version of Radiant Greninja, but in a stadium, which is pretty cool. The decks that come to mind that would want something like this are going to be decks that would maybe even just prefer Pokestop. So decks that want energy and discard are going to be decks, like fire decks. Those decks also might even want to play Magma Basin instead. Dark decks, since they can use Dark Patch, but again, Pokestop. Even something like Miraidon could, in theory, like this because some of those decks play Flaffy, but you would rather just have Beach Court there. So this card's not bad. I really don't think this effect is bad, but just seems like the decks that would ever want to play it already have other stadium cards that probably fill a more important role for their deck than this. But still not a bad card. Maybe this could see play. But that being said, guys, that is going to be the whole set. I don't know if you guys can tell, but I am super hoarse from going through all these cards. We looked at a ton today. But despite this being, I think, largely a more collector-oriented set, there's definitely still, I think, a handful of cards that could wind up being impactful here. I think a good chunk of the Pokemon EX do have some potential. But as always, I want to hear from you and what you guys think. Which of these new cards has you most excited in this Pokemon Card 151 set? Let me know your full thoughts down below in the comment section. But as always, guys, if you did enjoy today's content, remember to leave a like on the video. Or if you're feeling maybe a little extra generous and want to take that support to the next level, you can also become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or pick up some merch at rarecandytcg.com. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.